My dissertation revolves around the question, can building materials narrate a story? And if materials cannot speak, how do designers expand their potential to express narratives? I argue that materials cannot narrate a story because one might not hear the tale without background knowledge or text. However, the strategic use of materials provides a strong hint of narrative in a building. I started literature review to understand the concepts that revolved around this topic. Andrea de Plazes and Akos Morovensky both talked about material revealing sensory qualities, which is different from revealing clear and direct information about its history. Legerton and Wassau talked about evoking people's perception, which is similar to the suggestive quality of a hint. Picken and Greater talked about how there is a prism between the material and our perception. What we perceive at the end is materiality, which varies from person to person due to a lack of ability to convey direct messages by materials. Then, I continue with case study to clarify the arguments the authors made or expose the limitation of materials. I rate the projects according to my view of its success in narrative quality of materials. I rate 4 of them highly: restoration of St. Demetrius Church by Dimitris Pikionis, conversion of Gugalen House by Peter Zumthor, Riflemaker Gallery by Taylor and Damstar, and Youngwick Theatre by Hayward Tompkins Architects. What I learned from these examples will later reflect in my design process. I need a site that provides freedom for material exploration and a need for expression of narrative. Located at Wilrecote, Oxford, Godstow Abbey is an abandoned stone structure that used to be a nunnery and later a residence and a fortress. It sits beside the River Thames, and the road at the north leads to the Godstow Bridge that crosses the river. The remaining stone walls formed a large courtyard with 2 entrances. At the eastern tip stood the memorable structure of the abbey. The site has a collection of materials with a value of age. The dominant material is natural stone. The roughly coarse stones on the wall are small and bundled together. The stones at the opening frames have complex geometries. Larger stones are used at the foundation and corners. Climbing plants and grass have grown around the site. There are 4 stories throughout the history of the abbey which sculpted the identity of the structure. In 1138, Lady Edith, after the death of her husband, built the great church and established the nunnery in Godstow. She selected 24 ladies for a service and became the first abbess. In 1175, Rosamond, the love interest of King Henry II, sought protection from the nunnery. She was later murdered and buried in the abbey. In 1539, after the nuns left, the site was turned into a residence. In 1645, the site was turned into a fortress during the siege of Oxford and later abandoned. This is the speculative building plan of the nunnery. There are 2 courtyards in the Godstow nunnery. The outer guest court is close to the road, shielding the nuns' inner court at the south. The north facade presented the great church with the main entrance. A cloister led a path from the tower to St. Leonard's Chapel, which is still standing today. I translate 4 narratives into physical spaces. The red path is about the founding of the abbey. To represent the token of light that descended from the sky, I connected a looked-up point to the ground with a descending corridor that circulates the light well. The volume grew into an ample space to represent the aspiration of Lady Edith. The blue path is about the story of Rosamond. At the start, there are 2 paths intersecting with each other. This intersection represents the murder of Rosamond by the Queen. Rosamond was later reburied in the great church. Hence, her way exits the chapel and connects to the church and grew into a taller space, which represented the growth in faith. The purple path is about the demise of the nunnery. The green path is about the fortification and abandonment of the site. After that, I translate narratives into materials. For the establishment of the nunnery, I used coral rags because churches built in the mid-11th century used this local limestone. For a story of Rosamond, I picked the materials that were mentioned in her foretelling, which are timber and stone. For a story of the demise of the nunnery, I applied materials of the residence. During the Tudor era, the timber frame was widely used for houses with wattle and daub infill. For fortification of the site, I chose the materials of the fortress, which is the earth block. My design process is about illustrating the integration and intersection of different stories or materials. This is the moment where the path of Lady Edith, receiving the manifestation of love from God, crossed with the path 500 years later, when the parliamentarian marched towards the Goston Bridge after a conflict at the fortress. I decided to cover up the descending corridor for uninterrupted interaction of light with coral rag material on the wall. They were arranged with their density gradually increased from the top to the ground floor. The path of the parliamentarian spanned across the ground floor covered in earth block. As spaces are intended to be open air, the existing grass is shown at the ground of the light well. This moment is about the Queen intersecting the path of Rosamond. The path is blocked by an inclining elevated platform which represents the Queen, creating a distorted interior that represents conflict. The path of the Queen is covered with sharp twisting rusty metal strips to represent the conflict. The strips also broke apart the logs as they crossed the path. A visitor has to step onto the platform to move forward to the ruin of the nunnery wall covered with climbing plants. This moment shows the path where Rosamond's body was carried to be buried in the chapel. It intersects with the path where the civil war destroyed the residence 300 years later. It is predominantly covered with timber. A crossroad is formed when the path of the civil war intersects. It then leads to a large space which represents the residence. Rosamond was initially buried in the chapel before her prediction was realized. The timber path represents the short stay in Rosamond's story before the faith in her foretelling grew. The path turned left into the Great Church direction as the nuns later moved the tomb. I lay burnt timber strips on the floor to represent the theme. A few fresh timber strips grew out of the pile to represent revival. The strips grew denser as it approached the exit at the left. This moment shows the path of Rosamond intersecting with the grand space representing the church. The tunnel covered in timber approaching from the right is the path of Rosamond from the chapel. It intersected with the existing stone wall of the nunnery's inner court. The logs struggled their way through the cracks between the stones. This represented that Rosamond's foretelling became the truth as the timber metamorphosed into the stones, and this transformation happened as the faith in Rosamond solidified among the worshippers. The floor, being a mix of stone and timber, represents the dialogue between Lady Edith and Rosamond. This is the moment when the stones were taken away by the locals after the collapse of the fortress, marking the end of 4 stories. I pictured the fortress with beams stretching over the ceiling to represent rigidity and imprisonment. As the fortress collapses, the wall is left with broken edges, which leads to a path that represents the fall of the royalist Oxford. The path is partially blocked by a collapsed wall of the abbey. The muddy earth is like a flow of river, which carried away the building materials, people, and memories as time flows. This is my final design. In the first scene, large vertical sculpture will be placed on the ground of the light well to direct an audience attention vertically. For the parliamentarian path, I will replace the rusty metal strips with sculptures hanging on the ceiling and lying on the floor. In the second scene, I didn't add any sculpture to the scene because the inclined path itself is the showpiece. In the third scene, the large space representing residents are crowded with smaller sculptures to express the cozy atmosphere of a house. As we arrived at the chapel, I will have some sculptures that lay over the burnt sticks on the floor as if they had collapsed. In the fifth scene, the arrangement of materials on the floor react to a few large sculptures being laid in the area. We moved towards the fortress. I hang flat sculptures on the earth block wall so that the shadow play on the wall can also reflect on the sculptures. My conclusion is that materials may not narrate even with thoughtful design, but are capable to provide hints for visitors. I believe the suggestive quality of materials can inspire people to be curious and imaginative.